Okay. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I'll start off by introducing myself. Again, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's session titled "Embedding Equity, Building Capacity in Newcomer Services." My name is Timbi Giasu, and I'm a community coordinator with the Toronto Southwest Local Immigration Partnership. And I've had the privilege of organizing today's professional development session. The session itself will be running from 1 to 2:30. And as I just mentioned, we will be recording, but only for part of the session. So approximately the first hour of the session will be recorded. And then the second half of the session, or the last half hour, will be where you as participants will be able to be a part of an activity. And that part of it will not be recorded. So I'd like to provide just a bit of a background about today's session, and then I'll introduce our facilitator for today, and then I'll let her take it from there. So about today's session. So this professional development session, we hope that it will support frontline staff, program leads, and managers in deepening their understanding of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and being able to apply it meaningfully in your work. So it'll focus on building internal capacity to respond to the ever-evolving needs of newcomers while strengthening service delivery in our sector. So it'll be grounded, today's session will be grounded in anti-racism and anti-oppression principles. And we'll begin with a presentation that revisits foundational concepts and also explores current challenges and opportunities within our sector. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you as participants will be able to take part in a collaborative visioning activity designed to help connect these concepts to practical actions within your roles and your organizations. So today we have our facilitator, Bree Berry Crossfield, and I want to share a bit about her work and who she is before she gets started today. So Bree Berry Crossfield. She is an educator, a writer, and an EDIA consultant based in Toronto, with over a decade of experience building EDI, anti-racism, and disability initiatives in nonprofit and community spaces. Bree brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to her professional endeavors. She's recognized as an engaging and thoughtful speaker, facilitating anti-oppression and equity-informed workshops across the country. Her experience working with nonprofit organizations and education institutes includes Across Boundaries, Black Lives Matter Canada, the Canadian Federation of Students, the Neighborhood Group Community Services, Ontario Teachers Federation, and York University. At the core of Bree's work lies the ethos Principles Takes Practice. This guides her ongoing commitment to curating spaces that prioritize practical application and meaningful engagement with the social, political, and economic theories that shape these existing systems. Bree is dedicated to sharing knowledge and providing resources to support people and organizations as they build towards a new and inclusive future. Bree holds her BA in Communication Studies and Women and Gender Studies from Wilfrid Laurier University, and a Master's of Education in Social Justice Education from the University of Toronto. And with that, I will pass it along to Bree. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Team B. I see a few folks are just popping into the room. So while you were speaking, I've just admitted folks. Uh, I recognize that we don't have as much time together today, so I am going to have to skip some introductions. However, please feel free to use the chat. I understand that virtual presentations aren't always as interactive as we would like them to be. It's hard to have very free flowing conversation. So I'm hoping that if folks can stick around for the last half hour, that will be a time where we can really engage with each other. But please feel free in the chat to introduce yourself, your pronouns, which organization you're coming from, or your role as we work through as we go through our presentation today. I will also be monitoring the chat. Team Beat will also help me monitor the chat. And we do have some Mentimeters that I decided to do just this morning to hopefully encourage folks to use this space as a collaborative space. I do not currently work in newcomer services, so I am hoping that in this time that this is a place where folks who actually have the experience and also the knowledge, that this is an opportunity for all of us to collaborate together towards building solutions. So with that being said, let's get started. Oh, we don't need that timer there. So there will be, as I mentioned, there will be Mentimeters questions provided throughout the first portion of our workshop. So I'm going to encourage folks to use those spaces, and I'll happily send those Mentimeter results afterwards. Tim Beat, if you would mind just throwing it into the chat. For our workshop today, we are going to do, of course, a land acknowledgement and take about 5 minutes to do some reflection on that land acknowledgement, discuss a little bit about current challenges in newcomer services, move into talking about solidarity and collective action, as well as finding your role. This is a resource that I use very frequently. If you have been in a workshop with me before, you've likely seen this book. It's called Social Change Now, A Guide for Reflection and Connection. We'll be talking about finding your role and how we can envision what is crafted by Deepa Iyer, the social change ecosystem map. So how do we find space to also still create, how do we find space to create change even within our challenges? And then our last half hour will be visioning for change. So allowing us again to further discuss and collaborate. What are the conditions that folks are experiencing right now? What are the pressure points? But what are the opportunities that collaborating together can provide for us?
Put the Mentimeter in the chat, so hopefully folks can see it.
Thank you. Quick alarm there. So Toronto is covered under Treaty 13 in the Williams Treaties. It is the traditional territories of many First Peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. As the city continues to grow with settlers, newcomers, refugees, and Indigenous peoples, we recognize that land acknowledgements are often offered in place of land itself. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon wampum, which is here, shown on your screen, where nations entered into an agreement to protect the land and responsibly care for its resources in harmony together. As guests on this land, we have all been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We must remember that broken treaties persist across Turtle Island to this day and recognize our responsibilities as treaty people to engage in a meaningful, continuous process of truth and reconciliation with all of our relations. If you would like, as a reminder, of course, Indigenous youth are one of the fastest growing populations, especially in urban regions. I invite you to go into our Mentimeter, and we're going to take, let's say, maybe 2 minutes here. I see somebody's already started to answer our questions, which is great. Our question for reflection today is, how can you integrate Indigenous people of Turtle Island into your work to create opportunities for solidarity and shared goals on this land? I already see one comment here saying, be an ally, learn and unlearn, create awareness of challenges and barriers faced by Indigenous communities, acknowledge your own privileges and use it to learn and unlearn biases. I'm going to give folks a few minutes here to access that Mentimeter link that has been shared in the chat. This is a great opportunity where if you've had ideas or practices or things that you've done within your own organizations that you have found have worked really well, to please share with others. I also see some folks introducing themselves in the chat, which I definitely encourage that you continue to do as we go through our session today. Often we work in um, similar spaces, taking on similar roles, but we don't really know each other. So this is a great opportunity for folks to see who else is in the room, from what organizations, what are the opportunities. I see a question about sharing the recording with participants. Yes, the recording will be made available to folks. I'm going to give us one more minute here on that Mentimeter. I will ask folks to, again, use the Mentimeter as you see fit if you want to take some more time to reflect on it. Uh, the purpose is while the space is digital, I want it to be as collaborative as possible for all of us. And I see someone has mentioned that engagement and integration is an intentional doing, an ebb and flow of listening, actioning, and listening again. It is not a checkbox exercise. Thank you so much. For folks who just joined us, one of the questions we've asked with our land acknowledgement is how can you integrate Indigenous people of Turtle Island into your work to create opportunities for solidarity and shared goals on this land? Often when we talk about different demographics and populations, we tend to split ourselves out with the belief that, Indigenous folks have different needs or barriers to newcomers, have different, which of course they do. We all have differences and change and different cultures, different backgrounds of where we come from. But it is also important to remember that if we are all going to share the land, that we all have to be integrated with each other, sharing similar goals to this land. I see someone else has mentioned they would actively listen and learn to Indigenous communities, recognizing their sovereignty, respecting traditions, cultures, and teachings. Yes, because as important as it is to also learn about these histories of Indigenous people on Turtle Island, we have to remember that these are also still living, breathing populations who are continuing to create culture, we're continuing to create teachings, continuing to bring forward their knowledges, and that there is always an ongoing opportunity for us to engage with these within these spaces. I think I duplicated a slide by accident with workshop, but I also want to give us a quick refresher here because as I understand newcomer services is facing a lot of challenges. When we talk about Canada, we are facing a lot of challenges between I don't know if I can even find an accurate description to describe what is going on in the state of the United States right now, but we are watching um, a political upheaval that I again can't find the appropriate words because what I would use casually is a lot stronger than what I would use in these spaces. But we are seeing a mess happen, and we are also seeing the ricochet effects of that breakdown between our relationship with the United States and here in Canada. And what does that and the ricochet effects of also experiencing a pandemic a housing market that has become unaffordable, a desire to push back against change or difference, a strong voice that's also speaking up or speaking against um, progressive change, whether that's looking at immigration, education. We are seeing measures of austerity taking place, and I want to remind, as a refresher to everybody, that when we're having these conversations, we have to have these conversations about power and privilege. Of course, both of these resources here are actually from the Canadian Council for Refugees, where we look at privilege, as you can see in the circle here. It's like a pie, right? When you are close to the center of the pie, you end up, particularly in Canada, for example, having quite a few privileges. These are privileges that also interact with power and how we can use that power. But we see that often particularly in our newcomers, the difficulties of integrating from learning other languages and having to learn English, which will be something we discuss quite a bit here today, especially with the cuts to Link, a program that has existed here since the 90s. We are now seeing rapid reductions taking place, as Canada also shifts its position or stance on immigration levels. But there's other ways that privilege also comes into play, right? We have newcomers who sometimes show up with no status, who are refugees, who have precarious status, and we've seen how that pathway to citizenship has also become extraordinarily narrowed in the last few years. What does ability look like in living with a disability, having health issues? What does it look like to be a youth or elderly or somebody who's in the middle of middle aged, I suppose, here. So when we look at our privileges, it may be a hard conversation it may be hard for us sometimes to factor in that we have privileges. There are things that we are able to enjoy, not because we earned them, but because sometimes our identities have allowed us to have these privileges, but also that our privileges also come with what we can also intersect with power and what we can do with the power of the privileges that we have. And that can look like personal power, for example, often derived from charisma, self-confidence, self-respect, networks of support. You could, for example, say that because I work as a consultant and I do workshops and I facilitate, that I have a lot of personal power, that I know quite a few people, I have networks of support, I also come with degrees, so I carry quite a bit of personal power that is also further reified by my institutional power. I came from university education, Canadian university education, right? But institutional and organizational power, of course, is derived from our position, our mandate, resources, longevity or seniority in an organization. And we are also coming to terms right now with what happens when institutional or organizational power is no longer working towards our greater good. We also have collective power, which is a thing that we always have to struggle towards and work together. Building solidarity, community, empowering others, building creative action, and can also be used to organize against institutional as well as organizational power. This is the space. This is where we need to be learning to concentrate power, right? This is where we're trying to build capacity into our collective power and social power. So power that can be derived from aspects of our social identity, such as gender, race, class, sexual orientation. Again, when we look at that privilege wheel as well, we can see how privilege also looks like this social power, having social identities that bring us closer into that pie of what privilege looks like, and having identities that actually bring us further out and may create different challenges, barriers, or experience in our life. So I'm sure folks have seen these before. I decided to just take a quick or a quick Google into what has the news really been recording or discussing in terms of newcomer programming and what these cuts of immigration have looked like. We know, for example, as well, that Employment Ontario has also been undergoing a transformation where there is a heavy focus on numbers, which in many ways I feel can be quite in opposition to the goals of nonprofit organizations in particular, because I understand that numbers and data, collecting this data is good. It's a great way to help you measure impact. But often the impacts that we see within folks that we are working with, especially in frontline services, is qualitative. You can't always measure the results, right? You can measure, of course, for a program like Link from one person moving from English 1 all the way up to English 7, for example, but we have a hard time capturing the nuances of what that progress has actually looked like for newcomers, because often, at least in the work that I had done previously, I worked with students for nearly 10 years. It wasn't the fact that I got 25 students to show up to a program as much as it was nice to see students build. It was good to see a student who was building confidence as they continued to come to these programs, a student who felt more comfortable asking for help or for support. So we're seeing this is what is happening in the headlines. These are very early headlines starting all the way from January. So some of these closures, for example, in TDSB have already taken place. I also want to point to everybody, if you can kind of see, and you can mention it in the chat, what are you noticing here when we're talking about some of these sites that have been that were closed in March with these funding cuts? Is there anything that you folks have noticed in these neighborhoods? And you're free to jump to share it in the chat. I hope everyone is able to see my screen okay. One of the things I've noted when looking at these sites is that many of them are also in in neighborhoods or spaces. Yes. Oh, thank you. Someone has mentioned that they at Working Women, a person from Working Women has shared that they have had several cuts, but they'll mostly start in year 2 in 2026. I'm sure there's other folks who are experiencing similar preparations where you're getting some time to prep yourself for moving forward, but others are not necessarily in this position. And one of the things I noticed when they talked about these 4 sites from this article in the Toronto Star is that many of them are also in the areas where there are a lot of newcomers, a lot of new immigrants, a lot of folks who are concentrated in areas that tend to still be quote unquote somewhat affordable at this point. The city, the GTA is entirely unaffordable. I know the rents are supposed to be like cooling or coming down, but when you still have to pay over $2,000 for a 1 bedroom, is that really affordability, or is that just a theory of the invisible hand fixing itself? I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to speak too much to that. One thing I also noted too is that there was a study by the CBC that showed around 1/3 of Ontario newcomers are mentioning that they felt safer in their home countries. 29% of these are all folks who have arrived here in the last 10 years, so between 2014 to 2024. Many feel safer here than back home, but it is concerning that we're seeing also this increase in terms of worry, in terms of xenophobia, racism, and our the collective experiences that newcomers are also experiencing, where the hostility towards folks who have been promised to come here and make better lives for themselves are being scapegoated. And I think that begs the question if we are actually preparing people to integrate, or are we preparing them to be exploited? I see someone who's also mentioning here that the funding cuts have actually been deepest in west of the country. In Toronto, the average cut was 20% in fiscal year 2, which is challenging, but not compared to the closures we've seen out west. Yes, you are very correct. It makes it harder to advocate at a national level. IRCC is specifically cutting higher level classes because they decided to prioritize basic language as a way of prioritizing the most marginalized. The long-term effect is likely to be forcing more newcomers into survival jobs if they can't get their English up to the level required for anything else. Another impact may be opening of private higher language classes that have to be paid for. Yes, and thank you for sharing that piece, because often what we're also seeing is how our public dollars, our tax dollars, are being reorganized in a way that actually allows for further privatization, which allows for which also creates further barriers, because there's a difference between being able to access a publicly funded system versus having to figure out the quality of a the quality or the the usefulness, quote unquote, of private higher language courses, for example. So I think we all know this. Newcomers are not the enemy. But what we are seeing is that when we as a society experience ongoing hardship and pressure in meeting our minimum requirements for a decent life, I'm saying these are minimum requirements because there is a lot of political jargon that tends to punch down at people as a population, where it is considered that people don't want to work. Um, a lot of pushback we constantly see in conversations around a living universal basic income, for example, is that, oh, some people are just not going to work anymore. Rather than saying, well, there are some people who will never be able to work because of ability, because of age, and they still deserve to have a decent life, right? Or that some people may be able to continue to work, but now because of universal basic income, will not necessarily have to work 40, 60, 70-hour weeks to pay rent and take care of themselves. But it becomes very easy, right, for us to point fingers at communities that are most vulnerable to these challenges. These vulnerable populations often become our political scapegoats. We've seen this with trans folks, we've seen this with Black folks, we've seen this with poor people. We see this now with the continuous pushback against Indian folks who have been immigrating here for the last several years. We project our anger of systemic failures at those who have never actually been responsible for its operations. We, as I said, is the point of our immigrant is the purpose of our immigration system now to actually create different tiers that don't actually focus on integrating people as much as it is a focus on exploiting people, on allowing folks who could have had previous opportunities to improve themselves. I'm not just speaking specifically about adults, I'm also thinking about youth, as we know that youth also represent, I believe, from a 2021 census, newcomer youth represent anywhere between 10 to 15% of the city of Toronto, for example. So what is the future that we are also setting young people up for when we turn on each other in a way that frankly isn't really productive for any of us, but also feels easy, right? Because it's easy to say, well, you're the reason I can't get a job. You're the reason I cannot find rent. You are the reason this is happening, rather than also further interrogating that we are not the ones with the institutional or the organizational power. We are the ones with the power to be able to support these folks, but we are not the main decision makers, right? You folks are not here from the IRCC. You are not the ones who are sitting and looking at these numbers and drafting what these funding decisions look like. You are the ones who have to deal with the consequences of it, and in such, you are also having to navigate how the folks who come to you for these services are also having to navigate this, right? I am going to ask that we move to slide 2. If Tinbeat, if you're able to share the Mentimeter again, if folks can click that link, you'll notice that there's a next slide that asks what are current or other current myths that we are seeing about newcomers. I'm going to give folks about 2 minutes to jump into that link and share. If you already have Mentimeter open, you should be able to just click to a next slide.
Bree, you'd like me to reshare the initial Mentimeter? and it'll.
Yeah, if we
Okay.
can share, yeah, just if we can keep sharing it, as I realize a few folks have entered in
Yeah, no
um,
worries.
late, and I also want to allow folks to continue to have discussions with each other in the chat, so it's just easier for us to prompt rather than
Yeah, of course, no problem. It should be there for folks.
yeah. So it'll be the next slide for folks who started. We started with having a conversation about how to integrate Indigenous people into our work, but also now what are some of the current myths that we are also dealing with in terms of newcomers? See the previous question only. There should be a way to slide to press next in your Mentimeter. Oh, I have changed the slide here. Can folks let me know if this is, please wait. Interesting. I'm not sure why it's not allowing.
It looks,
Oh, it's working now.
yeah.
Okay, perfect. Oh, I see someone has commented as well. It's fine now in the Mentimeter. Thank you so much. So let's take 2 minutes and think, what are some of the current myths about newcomers? As I mentioned earlier, I worked with students for over 10 years. That included international students. And we often spent a lot of time doing a lot of myth busting around international students because as folks may know, we experienced in the 90s, international and domestic students actually used to pay the exact same tuition fees. And that was deregulated along with professional programs and other college and university programs. So if you wonder why some programs are more expensive than others, is because of deregulated tuition fees. And from that point as well, we started to also remove access to other sectors such as healthcare to newcomers. That included international students. So the argument often is that international students pay 2 to 3 times more than domestic students because we also have to cover not only them as human as their tuition fees, but also they're in many ways considered private citizens. They access private insurance. They don't have access to OHIP, for example. And the assumption is always that because the perception is that international students should be already coming with money. They should already have money. And I'm not saying that there are not international students who are definitely wealthy. I went to the University of Toronto. I've definitely seen wealthy international students, but I've also also worked with and met international students whose parents had to put a second mortgage on their home, who came from villages, who crowdfunded to save them. And this is actually even something that we can connect again back to how do we integrate Indigenous people into our work. Indigenous education is a treaty right. It is something that is supposed to be owed to Indigenous youth. They're supposed to be able to access an education. If you are registered with your band, some bands are able to send their youth to school. But often what also happens is that there's not enough funding to go around. So that means that there's decisions that have to be made for Indigenous folks in these bands of who gets to go to school, how much they can spend to send people to go to school. I met a woman who had a brother, and at the end of the day, they were both going to university at the same time, but their band decided that she would be funded for her full 4 years. There was not enough money to also fund her brother at the same time. That creates a lot of difficulties, right? So we're also seeing those similar myths. I'm looking here now at our Mentimeter that newcomers rely heavily on government assistance. They're causing housing shortages. They take jobs away from Canadians. They bring crime or insecurity. They are taking all of our taxpayer dollars. Folks get refugees coming to Canada or temporary residents get free services. There's a lack of the language level. Sorry. Someone has also mentioned myths that people are carrying more certifications, degrees, and so on. Um, they are only eligible to work in stores. They're occupying the job market. They are a burden to taxpayers. They use up the resources of citizens. They do not contribute to the economy. Newcomers take away jobs. So often see what we're seeing here again is um, these similar arguments that are again being weaponized against particular groups, in this case newcomers, that these are folks that are taking jobs, they are getting welfare, they are being treated much better than the quote unquote average or domestic Canadian. But we know that that is not necessarily the this is not necessarily the case, right? That folks are not coming in with, yes, we have folks who are able to come in because they have specializations and degrees, but we also know that our immigration levels have also shifted and fluctuated, also varies rapidly between government to government, era, time of years, where in previous years, yes, it was very hard to come into Canada because you needed to have A, B, C, D, you had to have very specific certifications to enter the country. But then we have the myth, for example, of the Indian doctor becoming a taxi cab driver because he comes with the certifications that give him the points to enter the country. But once inside the country, he is no longer considered a a specialist or somebody who was able to do the work that he was previously trained to do. And when you need to make money, you move into a gig economy. You move into, at the end of the day, rent's got to be paid, or my children need to be fed. I need clothes on my back. I need a winter coat, winter boots, and we tend to ignore that. That we again are we need immigrants. That is actually very core to Canada's prosperity and identity, particularly when we look at things like birth rate, when we look at things like um, diversity. We, being based in the city of Toronto, we know we love to brag about our food scene, our cultural scene. It's the summer now, so we have festivals from all over the world. You can go learn about Brazilian culture, Filipino culture, Tamil culture. There are so many cultures integrating into this mosaic, right? Um, but as I said, when we also start to see these stressors hit just not newcomers, but also people who have, but also folks who consider themselves born and bred Canadians, multi generational Canadians, it then becomes that the new people here are the reason why we are having these issues, right? So to that, I would say that, we also see that when these challenges start to happen, we also see a backlash to EDIA, so equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, right? But rejecting that is not actually a solution because all it does is create ripple effects, including Ontario. I am not taking away the critiques, the valid critiques or criticisms that folks can have in terms of, for example, education, where we saw institutions that were because they have moved from being first publicly funded institutions to publicly supported institutions. Those small language changes that we've been seeing over the last decade also meant that revenue sources had to come from elsewhere, right? And we saw that with colleges expanding rapidly, creating programs that were specifically for newcomers and international students to help balance their budget line. But now we're in this position where, again, our our motivations have changed, but now our universities and colleges are scrambling, right? We are now seeing nearly 10,000 college jobs may be at risk, according to OPSU, the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. International student numbers are being drastically reduced, which for that may not necessarily be an issue for an institution like, let's say, the University of Toronto, because the University of Toronto has maybe 1 in 5 of their students were international students. But for smaller provinces that also rely on education to help fund their economy and the dollars of international students, I'm thinking about spaces like Newfoundland and Labrador, for example. This is going. This is a problem, right? We're seeing York University, for example, cutting a lot of their programs because they don't have the money for it. Universities and colleges are now trying to figure out how to still offer a quality education if there is also going to be no follow-up from the federal or provincial governments in terms of raising those operational revenues so that folks can actually continue to do their work and continue to do their jobs. We also have issues within healthcare. We are seeing, especially in Ontario, despite the fact that other provinces have said, hey, this doesn't work too well, a tiered system, a tiered healthcare system, where we are taking our our public dollars and transferring them to create private healthcare spaces, which will only continue to increase barriers for vulnerable communities. Right? We are in a huge family doctor shortage. We are having difficulties accessing specialists, surgeries, other other healthcare needs, and that is not a newcomer's fault, right? That is not on somebody who has just gotten here. They are not the reason why you don't have a family doctor. But we also then justify that saying, well, some of us can wait and deal with a reduced public system that will continue to see these issues, while the people who can always and have likely always been able to afford private healthcare will just skip the line and move forward. But who will end up being blamed for for the privatization of this system, right? And finally, of course, housing. We know that people are living in unsafe conditions. Developers and private investments are driving supply and demand. I just read recently that there are some more condo projects that are being canceled or revisited now in the city, and that condo sales have been dropping rapidly. Which, yeah, we stopped building 3 bedrooms. We You can barely find a 2 bedroom home. How do you expect newcomers, particularly newcomers with children, to survive in these kinds of spaces, right? We've seen stories of people living by anywhere between 5 to 20 people shoved in a rooming house or basement apartments. Rents and mortgages are continuing to be out of reach for low and middle income families. So again, as I said, newcomers are not the enemy, but they're also experiencing these conditions at the same time that we are. We're not experiencing these things in parallel to each other. We're experiencing them together, right? And I say all this to say, do not let despair consume you. Um, One of the tactics that has been reflected on through, let's say, the in our conversation around what is going on in the United States is that I believe, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, I believe it was Steve Bannon who gave an interview 10 years ago, who talked about flooding the system. And flooding the system is simply what we're seeing, right? We're seeing rapid changes that are meant to confuse the population, that are meant to confuse us, that are meant to make us upset or scared or afraid. And I'm speaking to this knowing full well that, of course, while we live in Canada, we are far too close just by geographic proximity, culture, exports, trade with the US to not also see how this also impacts us, right? So we can't also allow despair to consume us, because that is part of the tactic, right? That is part of flooding the system. That is part of making these cuts. That is part of making austerity measures and saying, well, we can't do anything. Because my question, for example, is the fact that, okay, we're reducing funding because we're bringing in less immigrants. But we also know that, for example, with like link programs, I just heard recently, this morning, actually, on the news, that there's a school in Quebec that is facing fines for over enrolling people into their English courses. And their response has been, well, the demand is still there, right? Like the demand is high. We kind of we're trying to help people. So my question then becomes, so if we are reducing levels, or if we're reducing immigration levels, but we still know that there's a high need or demand to raise these people's English languages up, for example, to help them find jobs, to help them to skill up, to help them to recertify. Why does it make sense to also be making these huge swaths of cuts, particularly in provinces as well? That also, Ontario is a very big place. We are the largest population in the entire country, but other places also need folks. We need workers. We need students. We need educators. We need doctors. This is not just an Ontario issue. It is a country issue, but we cannot allow ourselves to believe that there's nothing that we can do, that we cannot push back, that we cannot um, confront what we have, but also that we cannot survive. I understand that folks have mentioned too that there's been organizations that have been defunded entirely, which, oh, sorry, can folks still see me okay? I tapped my screen and it blacked out on me for a moment there.
Yeah, we can
But
still see you.
okay, good. I but despair is not a solution. Throwing our hands up, giving up and saying, well, I don't know what to do, Bree, so like there's no point in us doing anything, that's not a solution, right? So what can we start doing? We can advocate. We can contact our local politicians, make their staff hear you, say that this is wrong, say that, hey, I work in these services and you're not helping us. Building bridges right now. I'm really happy to see folks are chatting with each other in the comments. Folks are taking time to introduce themselves. Please, if you want to connect with each other further, I understand that there's already a network that already exists, but utilize that network, build these bridges, resist silos and isolation. If you are all in the same boat and there's holes in the bottom of the boat, everybody needs to bail water, right? So build these bridges now, bail out the water, educate as well. Use your voice and your knowledge wherever you are. Share the resources, dispute the misinformation. Do not let the loudest voices be the least experienced or the folks who do not know what they're talking about taking a lead. We have a tendency to believe that because somebody is loud and passionate that they are right. We also need to match that energy when we are educating people because we know that we can also be loud and be right. Get creative with our funding. What do you do when money is not the option or the solution? How do we actually remove money as the primary solution to how we get to do our work? I think there are ways that we can be more creative with each other. I am going to talk to you a little bit about a case, about some of the things that we did in my workplace previously during, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic, because we have to be able to take action, right? We have been through this before and we'll probably go through it again. That is, in many ways, unfortunately, the lesson of life is that there will always be challenges. There will always be issues of power, of people in power not wanting to do what is right for the collective, not right for their communities. And we still have to be willing to get up and keep fight and push back, right? So a case study of adjusting when there is no choice. So as I've mentioned several times now, my background is in education and specifically education advocacy. I worked at the University of Toronto. I worked at the University of Toronto, and one of my roles for a time was supporting students, the membership of the Association of Part-Time Undergraduate Students, which in many ways is actually quite reflective of the broader society that we live in, right? Or can be reflective, for example, of newcomers to this country. APIS's demographics was heavily racialized. Many of our folks were disabled. They were low income. We had a lot of mature students. We dealt with student parents, and we kind of got hit with a twofer in terms of what took place between about 2018 to 2020. And we saw the election of Doug Ford. And with the election of Doug Ford, attempts to make cuts to our programming. As student unions, we are nonprofit organizations, but we also collect fees similar to a union, right? Student unions. As this is something that has been integrated within the broader Ontario legislation regarding Ontario universities and colleges. We are considered ancillary fees. So what Ford tried to do was cut our ancillary fees to narrow them down to what is essential. He did not want to see us doing EDI work. He did not want to see us doing advocacy work. He did not want us to have the collective capacity to push back when we saw our government making decisions that were not good for youth, were not good for students, were not good for us. And in that, while this legislation was inevitably overturned, we won, there was still issues, right? We saw student unions that were losing across Ontario that went from having their full funding to being cut down to about 30% of their funds. There were student unions that nearly closed because of this, despite the fact that many of our student unions offer health insurance are the ones who offer health insurance to our students, who offer multiple programs. We can think about an example. For example, at the University of Ottawa, it is considered an affordable university in many ways because they don't actually do a lot of additional programming, ancillary programming. A lot of it actually came directly out of the student union. So when your student union is getting hit, and the student union is the one who provides a lot of these additional programs to students, of course it's going to have an impact. And then we moved as we moved away from what was called the Student Choice Initiative, then we got hit with the COVID-19 pandemic, which we, as student unions, and I'm sure as folks who also provide frontline services and newcomer services, none of us were operationalized to be online, because community engagement meant in-person engagement, right? You want to be able to be as barrier-free and as accessible as possible. And you can also develop relationships differently in person versus the relationships that you're able to develop online with each other, right? So when the pandemic hit and we realized that we were in a position that we could not bring our members into our spaces anymore, we had to navigate this era where people are being told to stay home, that they are now losing access to some of these services. We knew that we had folks who were struggling with food insecurity. We had to start thinking a little bit more creatively. And so what we were able to prioritize was digital access, food, and how do we actually also help build an awareness and an ability to also manage this crisis and this stress. So we started, for example, with a laptop loan program, because many of our members, particularly mature students, did not have access to a computer. They went to the library. So if the library is closed, they can't actually complete their schoolwork. We were able to buy about 10 laptops for students who could no longer access the library, and we created it on an honor system. Here you go, here's a computer, bring it back when you need it, which often many students did at the end of a semester, so that other students would be able to use it. We transitioned because we believed that one of our core priorities is that in every program we had, we offered food. We made sure that meals were available, because we know that many of our students did struggle with food insecurity, and we wanted to make sure that they had meals, especially meals that were not necessarily just pizza, right? But because we were not in a position to actually, again, bring people into our spaces and feed them, we started providing grocery gift cards. And the reason we specifically did grocery gift cards was to consider that people may have food allergies or other considerations that we could not account for with other digital gift card services. And at the time too, these grocery gift cards, I believe we used some specifically, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but it was local Canadian grocers. So like your Sobeys, your Loblaws, which I recognize are also quite expensive, but we also didn't have to pay any service fees on those. And these meals so we reallocated that budget where you would receive anywhere between $15 to $20 when you came to our program. So as long as you attended, you received a digital gift card. Was it going to be the exact same as being able to provide people a warm meal right in front of them as we took these programs? Of course not. But it was a way to make sure that we were still helping our members eat. Finally, one of the things we also decided to introduce was somatic therapy, trying to treat the trauma of COVID, supporting the release of stored emotions. It was something that we started doing around exam periods in particular, because we knew already that exam periods tended to be a very high pressure or very stressful time of year for our students. And we wanted to teach them or help them learn how to maintain a focus on their mental health and provide tools to them to keep awareness in their body, to help release these deep emotions. Because of course, as we all remember, when COVID first hit, the waves of how we felt about it at first, getting to work from home was absolutely great, and then it became, some of us could not actually functionally work from our homes, and that created more issues. Some of us could not study as well as we needed to in our homes. So having folks create strategies. This was also practice where we brought in Nazba Tom. They are an Indigenous somatic practitioner who's based here in Toronto. Who are based here in Toronto. I'm actually just going to type out their name here because I realized I did not link them directly in the chat, but folks are free to look them up, because I believe my question here for folks is, what were previous tactics, or rather, what were previous solutions or tactics that we have no longer been considering in our present time? I think as we've moved more towards hybrid work, or many of us trying to, of course, forget our experiences in the pandemic, we are also forgetting things, or we can be forgetting practices that would be helpful for us, right? And I do just want to remind folks as well, when we say do not despair, this is a quote by Grace Lee Boggs. A revolution that is based on the people exercising their creativity in the midst of devastation is one of the great historical contributions of mankind. We can be creative. We can figure out new ways to do this. We can figure out how to how to be creative with our funding, how to support our newcomers, how to push back against these myths against newcomers, and continue to move forward. At this time, I'm going to ask that we stop the recording, because it is 2 o'clock.